They never opened the coffins. Not once, not when grieving mothers screamed for proof. Not when officials quietly begged for access. And not even when the smell of untouched embalming fluid lingered beneath the soil. In 1864, deep in the forests of Pennsylvania, there stood a hospital unlike any other, a place where patients vanished. Bodies were buried in sealed boxes, and death certificates were signed by men who never met the dead. The town called it Charity Hill Sanitarium. Locals called it the Silence, because after someone entered, no one ever spoke their name again. This isn't folklore. This isn't campfire myth. This is archived, recorded, and quietly erased history. What happened behind the red brick walls of that hospital was so calculated, so methodical, that it couldn't have been madness. It had to be structure. This was not a collapse of morality. This was its replacement. A system of care designed not to heal, but to remove. And it began with a lie so perfect, no one thought to question it, that the mentally ill needed to be separated for their own good. But what they didn't say is who got to decide who was ill. When government funding poured in during the height of the Civil War, Charity Hill expanded overnight. A facility originally built for 16 patients ballooned to over 200 beds. And yet, almost no patient record survived, no full census, no discharge logs, just funeral bills, sealed coffins, and one surviving nurse's journal, discovered decades later beneath the floorboards of a condemned caretaker's homepages, soaked in water damage, mildew, and guilt. Her name was Eliza Rook. She was 23, and on November 14th, 1864, she wrote a sentence that should have shaken the earth. They bury them full of nothing. The boxes are lighter than a child's casket. The doctor says it's mercy, but I don't believe mercy smells like chloroform. What follows in her writings, and what this video will now reveal, will not comfort you. It will not entertain you, but it may wake you. Because once you understand what Charity Hill was built for, once you see the machinery of institutional silence, you cannot go back to sleep. And if you're still here by the time we hit the halfway mark, you'll have a chance to choose whether you're just watching or finally remembering. Ready? Let's descend. Asterisk, the land beneath Charity Hill wasn't chosen for peace or proximity. It was chosen for isolation. 2 miles outside the nearest village, hemmed in by a dying forest and fed by a single dirt road, the hospital sat like a scar on the earth, deliberately placed where screams would have no echo. They said it was to keep the patients calm. But the villagers knew better. It wasn't the patients who needed silencing. It was the staff. The original builder was a surgeon named Dr. Amos Kellerman, a man whose credentials were impeccable, yet whose personal life was a graveyard of disappearances. 3 sisters gone, 1 wife never located. An adopted son who vanished from census records at age 10. Kellerman was never charged, never questioned. He was too valuable. A pioneer in what they called containment medicine. His theory? That mental illness could be spread by empathy, by proximity, by the contagion of suffering. The cure, he claimed, was distance. Extreme distance. So when he was offered full control of a new state-funded hospital in rural Pennsylvania, he accepted. On one condition, no oversight. And they gave it to him. Because the war was bleeding the Union dry. Every soldier hallucinating from trauma. Every wife shattered by grief. Every child acting strangely. They were threats to productivity. Charity Hill wasn't built to cure them. It was built to erase them. Patients were admitted without trial, without hearing, without diagnosis. A single letter from a spouse, a priest, or a sheriff could land you inside. And once you were inside, your name was smudged from existence. No correspondence, no visitation, no burial records that listed next of kin. Just coffins delivered in wagons, signed with a doctor's scribble, and lowered into earth with no one watching. And here's the part that should freeze your blood. The empty coffins, They weren't buried just to fake deaths. They were decoys, misdirections, because the real question isn't why the coffins were empty, it's where the bodies went. And for that answer, you have to understand the tunnels. Charity Hill wasn't just a building. It was a labyrinth. A subterranean grid of stone halls and windowless chambers, built not for healing, but for storage. Not of supplies. Not of medicine, but of human beings. Of minds deemed dangerous. Of secrets too inconvenient to be left walking. Keep watching. We're going deeper. The first man who tried to map the tunnels was a janitor named Ellis Baird. His job was simple: carry coal to the lower furnaces, mop the medical wings, and keep his mouth shut. For 3 years he did exactly that. Then one day in 1867, he didn't show up for his shift. They found his toolbox leaning against the southern wall near the west stairwell. Inside it was a crude sketch, drawn on the back of a patient inventory sheet. It showed 4 levels below the hospital basement, each marked with red X's and dates. Those dates all matched days patients had been discharged. Ellis was never seen again. That was the first real clue. Up until then, people assumed the hospital was simply negligent or cruel. The idea that it was something else, something designed from the foundation to conceal movement, to process and dispose of people like livestock, that didn't fully take hold until Ellis disappeared. But when the staff were questioned, they said he never worked there. When his sister arrived with a letter he'd mailed the week before, the administrators claimed the letter was forged. They called the local sheriff, who confiscated the note and arrested her for public disturbance. She vanished on her way to jail. The thing about institutions like Charity Hill is that they aren't built to treat illness. They're built to define it, to make it whatever those in power say it is. Grief becomes pathology. Dissent becomes madness. A woman who sees patterns too clearly? Hysteria. A man who remembers too much? Paranoia. A child who dreams too vividly? Hallucinations. And once that label is applied, every word they speak becomes invalidated by design. Every scream becomes further proof of their broken mind. It's a perfect trap, but the tunnels, they were never meant to be found. A select group of orderlies had keys. The keys were custom forged and numbered in a way that revealed nothing. No maps existed above ground. Each corridor below was marked only by scratches, symbols from some private system. There were no doors, only hatches, and there were no beds. Just rings in the floor. Chains, sometimes still warm to the touch. The deeper you go into those tunnels, the more you stop asking why people died. You start asking why they were kept alive at all. And what was being done to them. Asterisk, it always starts the same. A blank entry. A coffin ordered, a death certificate signed, but no autopsy, no signature from the family, no witness to the burial. Then days later, another blank entry. Different name, different floor, same outcome. They said it was consumption. They said it was hysteria. They said the body had to be sealed for public safety. But when the graves were quietly exhumed years later by relatives who refused to believe the silence, they found something worse than decay. They found emptiness. Row after row of coffins filled with straw. Or nothing at all. Between 1864 and 1871, Charity Hill Hospital buried over 300 patients. By official record, but only 91 of those graves contained bodies. Do you understand what that means? This wasn't clerical error. This wasn't simple negligence. It was a pattern, systematic, methodical, and deliberate. And yet, the more people asked questions, the less they found. Medical logs went missing. Birth certificates disappeared. Names were quietly erased from state census rolls. Even family portraits were stolen. Entire bloodlines were being erased. Like chalk from a slate. There are things this country was built on that have nothing to do with freedom or justice. There are networks of power, old, silent, patient, that use institutions not to heal, but to study, to test, and sometimes to harvest. Charity Hill was never just a hospital. It was a proving ground. In 1868, a telegram was intercepted by a telegraph operator in Harrisburg. It was intended for a federal agency that didn't exist. The message read, Series 6 shows 94% compatibility. Neural mapping stabilized. Commence replication cycle C. Dispose of remnants immediately. The operator, an honest man, tried to report the transmission. Within 48 hours, his station burned to the ground. His family left town. They didn't take anything with them. He was never seen again. What kind of experiment leaves no data? What kind of hospital buries 200 empty coffins? You're not hearing this by accident. They buried more than patients at Charity Hill. They buried attempts, failed copies, lives that weren't deemed optimal. And once you see that pattern, once you start pulling at that thread, you realize this wasn't the only facility, not even close. There were others, dozens, each with their own methods, their own objectives, but they all had one thing in common. None of them ever kept the dead where they claimed to put them. Asterisk. They called it mercy. That's how they justified the silence. That's how they soothed their conscience, those few who had one left. When families arrived asking about their loved ones, they were met with nurses who spoke like rehearsed actors. She passed peacefully in her sleep. He suffered no pain. The records were lost in the fire. Always the same lines, always the same glazed-over eyes. And when a body was requested for proper burial, it came in a sealed coffin nailed shut, with strict orders not to open it ever. But some families did, and what they found shattered the illusion. Coffins with bricks inside, weighted burlap sacks. In one infamous case, an entire child's casket was filled with surgical gloves, clean, unused, still powdered, as if mocking the idea of dignity, as if reminding anyone who looked too closely, this was never about healing. It was about control. You have to understand something about the 1860s. While the nation bled through the Civil War, while brother killed brother over the illusion of freedom, another war was being waged underground quietly, surgically. A war on the mind, a war on the soul. A war waged by men in black suits who never carried guns, but whose pens were dipped in blood. These weren't doctors in the traditional sense. These were philosophers with scalpels, bureaucrats with God complexes. And they saw every wounded soldier, every sick child, every grief-stricken widow as nothing more than a variable, a subject, a sample. Charity Hill wasn't built to treat the poor. That was a smokescreen. It was built to understand something ancient, something hidden inside us. They were looking for signal purity, a term that appears over and over in their recovered documents. They believed certain minds, certain bloodlines, carried resonance, like tuning forks for consciousness. And the rest? Disposable noise. It's easy to look back and say it was madness, that it was pseudoscience or superstition. But explain this. Why did 3 of the original attending surgeons vanish within the same week in 1869? Why did their families change? Their names flee to opposite coasts and burn every photograph ever taken of them. Because they had seen something, and once you see it, you can't go back. Asterisk. The hospital's west wing was never listed on official blueprints. It appears in no architectural records, no city plans, not even in the insurance documents filed after the second-floor fire in 1871. Yet survivors, what few still lived into the 20th century, spoke of it with the kind of hush reserved for things that should never have existed. They called it the long room, not because of its size, but because of how time itself changed inside it. Men brought in for routine treatment would come out days later, aged hair gone white, eyes sunk, unable to speak more than a whisper. One nurse wrote in a hidden diary, later recovered behind a false wall. They say the long room is for observation, but I've seen no observation windows, only locks on the outside. And the sounds, dear God, the sounds. Here's where it starts to turn. On December 3rd, 1865, a shipment arrived under military escort, 6 iron-bound crates, no labels, no manifest. Witnesses say the men delivering them refused to enter the premises, leaving the crates at the front gate. Inside those crates were anatomical models. At least that's what the staff was told. But one of the attendants, a former mortuary apprentice, recognized the stitching. These weren't models, they were bodies, not just human. Not entirely. And that's when the changes began. Patients began sleep-talking in languages. No one recognized tongues without roots in Latin or Greek. Symbols were found carved into the backs of doors, matching glyphs recorded in Mesopotamian ruins thousands of miles away. One soldier, admitted for simple fever, gouged out his own eyes and screamed for the watchers to stop looking through him. No one ever explained what those crates were, or why the military abandoned them at a hospital supposedly meant for civilians. But here's what the records do show. A month after the crates arrived, Charity Hill received a private grant from the War Department. The amount was never disclosed. The signatures were redacted. But the hospital expanded its West Wing rapidly, in secret, without permits. And the long room began its nightly operations. It said the dead were brought there. But not for burial. Not even for study, for listening. Because someone or something was talking through them. And the men running the hospital were taking notes. By early spring of 1866, Charity Hill's reputation had taken on a strange polarity. In official circles, it was celebrated as a model of modern rehabilitation, a symbol of post-war progress, reformation, and humanitarian medicine. The hospital administrator, Dr. Elijah Rourke, was even invited to speak at the Philadelphia Academy of Science. But back in the valley below the ridge, the locals whispered a different story, one of nightly howls, vanishing farm animals, and thick, sour smoke that rose from the West Wing's chimney, despite no known furnace or crematory on site. Every few weeks, a horse-drawn cart would leave the hospital just before sunrise, covered in black cloth, flanked by 2 silent orderlies. It always took the same winding road north, toward the old mining tunnels sealed after the 1852 collapse. Those tunnels had long since been condemned by the state, but something was being buried there. Not coffins, not bodies. Weight, secrets. Things no one dared ask about. One cart overturned during a spring flood. A local farmer found it days later, washed up in the marsh. There were no bodies, just linen sacks filled with charred bones that were small, too small, like those of children. But the hospital hadn't admitted any child patients. At least, not according to the logs. Unless those weren't patients. Unless those were outcomes. Experiments. See, the deeper you look into Charity Hill, the clearer it becomes. This was not a hospital in the conventional sense. It was a filter, a funnel, a place where unwanted questions were turned into silent graves, where anomalies were recorded, tested, then erased. Dr. Rourke had a term for certain patients, those with behaviors that didn't fit any diagnostic category. He called them echoes, men who returned from war with memories of battles that never happened, who spoke of captains that didn't exist, who could predict the exact date and hour of solar eclipses decades away, men who dreamed of places with geometries not possible on Earth. One echo insisted he had been underground for 11 years. Another claimed to have awoken in someone else's body. The files on these patients are thin, many pages have been burned, others redacted by hand in thick tar-like ink. But one margin note survived, scribbled in Rourke's tight, slanted hand. They speak in unison at dusk, same words, always the same. Something is reaching through. Whatever reached through, it reached someone on the other side. And they started answering back. You weren't supposed to hear. About patient 133. His name was erased, his record sealed. and his presence at Charity Hill never acknowledged in the state's official census. But he was there, deep beneath the West Wing, in a subterranean ward that didn't exist on any architectural plans. No windows, no visitors, just one heavy iron door and a guard who changed every 6 hours, never the same man twice. He arrived in February 1865, hand-delivered by a Union officer with no insignia, no papers, and eyes that never blinked. The man who delivered him left before dawn and was never seen again. No signature, no trace. Patient 133 never spoke, at least not in English. But he wrote in symbols. Hundreds of pages, all of them confiscated and marked Foreign Cognition Hypothesis. The hospital kept them in a locked drawer labeled Meteorology, a misdirection, but not a lie. Because the symbols he wrote, they started showing up in weather patterns, etched in ice on windows before snowstorms, found burned into barn roofs after lightning strikes. Staff began having synchronized dreams, always the same. A vast stone, circle under black stars, a tower that breathed, and a sound low constant, like thunder from within the earth. Nurses started collapsing without explanation. One orderly spoke in tongues for 3 straight hours, then went blind. Said he saw the blue people behind the mirror and refused to look at glass ever again. Dr. Rourke assigned 2 specialists to monitor patient 133 full-time. One disappeared. The other was found wandering barefoot 12 miles away, hands covered in blood that wasn't his. He died 2 days later. Brain hemorrhage from auditory overstimulation, a diagnosis that doesn't exist in modern medicine. And then came the night of March 19th. The hospital's clocks stopped at 3:07 a.m., all of them. Every watch, every wall clock, even the grandfather clock in Rourke's private office. For exactly 7 minutes and 13 seconds, the facility was silent. Not asleep-silenced. Afterward, 5 patients were dead. All in separate rooms, no signs of trauma, no known connection. But when their bed sheets were removed, each mattress bore the same burn mark, seared into the wool, a perfect circle with 3 slashes through it. The same symbol patient 133 had drawn over and over. That was the night Dr. Rourke submitted a classified report to the U.S. War Department. The subject line, psychogenic weaponization potential. That was also the last night patient 133 was seen alive, or at all. His body was never recovered. But for weeks afterward, the West Wing echoed with a low hum that made teeth ache and dogs flee. The nurses began calling it the morning song. No one ever figured out who or what it was mourning for. After the disappearance of patient 133, Charity Hill shifted. Not just in behavior, but in structure. Corridors once straight began to warp ever so slightly, like the angles were fighting against Euclidean geometry. Doors led to rooms that hadn't existed on the blueprints. Storage closets opened into bricked-in walls. A staircase on the eastern side began descending 3 steps, farther than it ever had before. Dr. Rourke blamed fatigue, stress, cognitive displacement due to overexposure to patient delusions. But the staff whispered another theory. The hospital was waking up. The basement archives where admissions were recorded, autopsies filed, and discharge papers sealed was where the first real break happened. In April 1865, a janitor named Marlowe accidentally dropped a kerosene lamp. The fire burned for 11 minutes before it was extinguished. But what the flames revealed was far worse than what they destroyed. Behind a scorched section of wall, firefighters uncovered a hidden storage room. Within it were 47 unburied coffins, all labeled, all sealed, all empty. And stacked beside them, rotting under time and mold, were the hospital's first burial manifests. The names matched the coffins, but none of them had ever been officially admitted. No records, no medical files, no diagnoses. Just names, most of them children. Ages 6 to 13. One entry, simply read, Subject 7. Female. Speech, glossolalia. Condition, inverted cognition. Status, compliant. Another, Subject 12. Male, no visible pupils, responsive to infrared. These were not patients. These were experiments. Collected, contained, discarded. When Dr. Rourke was confronted, he gave no denial. Only a sentence that chilled the soul of everyone present. There are sicknesses, he said, that don't infect the body. They infect the timeline. He called it chronotraumatic pathology. The theory that trauma, under certain conditions, becomes contagious not only across space but across time. That pain can echo backward, reshaping history. That memory, when amplified, can become a weapon. He believed these children weren't sick. They were symptoms. Echoes from futures that had already collapsed, but the War Department didn't want theories. They wanted weapons. And so, in July 1865, Charity Hill was quietly absorbed into a classified program, labeled only as Section M. All patient deaths were recategorized as containment failures, and all surviving staff were required to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of sedition. The coffins were never buried. They were moved docked to a chamber beneath the new wing. A wing sealed off within a month due to structural instability. No one noticed the new wing had no doors, only walls. Walls that breathed when no one was watching. Asterisk, by the fall of 1865, Charity Hill was no longer a hospital. It was a containment structure. Officially, the facility continued admitting patients, mostly Civil War veterans suffering from melancholia, shell shock, or spiritual malaise. But no one ever saw these men leave. No graves were dug. No carriages arrived to take them home. They were admitted. And then they vanished. Records began to show a strange pattern. Every third patient had the same birthday, August 9th. Different years, different places of birth, but always the same day. Physicians noted strange reactions during physical examinations, heartbeats that syncopated with nearby ticking clocks, pupils that dilated at the precise moment chapel bells rang. No matter where the patient was in the building, something was aligning. The local clergy grew suspicious. Father Alden Rusk, a Jesuit scholar from Pittsburgh, attempted an exorcism after visiting the site for last rites. His report, which never reached Rome, but was intercepted by Army intelligence, contained a line circled in black ink. This place is not haunted, it is haunting. The townspeople of Wilton began reporting dreams, not nightmares, but dreams of vivid clarity. Always the same setting, a hospital corridor with no ceiling. Wind overhead, rows of empty gurneys, bloodless patients staring at them with stitched-shut eyes. In each dream, the corridor never ended. It just kept going. And if you turned around, the way you came was gone. The youngest children in town stopped speaking altogether, not out of fear but reverence. One boy, age 7, was recorded as whispering only 3 words before lapsing into permanent silence. They buried futures. Inside the facility, Dr. Rourke's behavior became increasingly erratic. His notes, once methodical and brilliant, now spiraled into obsessive diagrams, looping sigils, and Latin phrases no scholars could translate. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He began claiming that Charity Hill had woken up to itself. 1. Nurse Leela Gaines kept her own journal. It survived. In it she wrote, "The building has moods now. It favors some and punishes others. It hates when we whistle. It rewards silence." She vanished on October 12th. Her shoes were found outside the eastern wall, carefully placed. No signs of a struggle. No prints in the mud. Just 2 parallel lines drawn in the soil leading straight into the stone foundation, like something or someone had been pulled through. and Charity Hill never logged her as missing. The ledger simply read, "Discharged. Asterisk the government." Ever cautious, deployed a 3-man survey team to assess the structural integrity of Charity Hill after growing public unrest. They weren't doctors, they weren't priests. They were engineers, but not of the ordinary kind. Their papers were signed by a branch of the War Department that had no official name and no traceable funding. One of them, a man named Beringer, wore a lead medallion around his neck engraved with concentric circles and an unblinking eye. They entered the building on a Tuesday morning. By Friday, only one returned. He arrived barefoot, clothes torn and caked with dirt, and carrying the charred remains of a clipboard. His hands were bandaged in what appeared to be medical gauze, but no hospital ever claimed to have treated him. When questioned, he responded only with, "It breathes through the basement." The burned clipboard contained fragments of sketches, a spiral staircase that went down 12 levels, a cross-section of subterranean chambers beneath the hospital, footprint, and an outline of a circular room labeled simply Echo Vault. None of these features had ever been noted in architectural blueprints. The government sealed Charity Hill off the following week. Officially, a quarantine for a typhoid outbreak. But there were no patients inside, at least none that spoke. What remained was something else. Something that pulsed behind stone and time and bureaucratic silence. Then came the train incident. November 2nd, 1865. A westbound freight train derailed half a mile from the facility under mysterious circumstances. No one died, but all 9 crewmen claimed they were unable to see the track before the crash. "It just vanished," the conductor testified, "like we passed through a curtain." He added something else reluctantly when we walked back. Toward the wreckage, the hospital had moved. It wasn't behind the hill anymore. It was closer, much closer. One crewman, a young brakeman named Elijah Poole, was found sitting on the steps of the hospital's main entrance naked, eyes open, smiling. He'd gone missing 2 hours prior and had apparently walked to the building on his own. He could not or would not speak. But when given paper, he drew circles, always circles, and in the center of each, an open coffin, empty, over the next. 2 months, the same image appeared in the dreams of military officers, local clergy, and men who had never even heard of Charity Hill. Something was leaking. Something buried. And the coffins, those endless, empty coffins, weren't for the dead. They were for something that hadn't happened yet, something still waiting to wake. You need to understand what they were really doing beneath that hospital, because it wasn't just medicine. It was something older than science, older than scripture. And it began with the doctrine of resonant anatomy, a theory proposed by Dr. Julian Marrow, one of the original founders of Charity Hill. His name has been stripped from the records, but fragments remain, letters, notes, scribbled formulas found etched into the wood beneath patients' beds. Dr. Marrow believed that human organs could be attuned to frequencies, certain combinations of sound and silence that could unlock dormant aspects of consciousness. This wasn't about healing, it was about access. The kind that bypasses language, bypasses pain, bypasses even death. According to a surviving page from Marrow's personal log, he developed a device, a table of some kind, carved entirely from white pine and copper coils. The patient would lie down, electrodes placed along the spine, and then the room would be sealed. What happened next wasn't documented in clinical terms, but it was always the same pattern: unconsciousness, seizure, then silence. Always silence, not just from the patient, but from the building itself. One nurse claimed the clocks would stop ticking for exactly 4 minutes. The flames in the gas lamps would dim, not flicker dim, as though something in the room was inhaling all energy. One attendant, after the 4th session, was found hanging in the boiler room. He had no prior signs of distress, but he left a note, smeared in soot. "They aren't looking at us. They're listening. These sessions were not isolated. The device was used weekly, sometimes nightly, on patients selected for deep evaluation. These were not always the mentally unstable. Sometimes it was the quiet ones, the polite ones, the ones who claimed to hear singing beneath the floors at night. And here's where the deeper horror begins. The majority of those patients were reported as deceased within 48 hours, yet their families were never allowed to see the bodies. Empty coffins, sealed shut, buried at midnight with no clergy and no rites, no autopsies, no official cause of death. Just silence. And yet, certain locals swore they saw these same individuals walking the fields weeks later, pale, mouths moving, but no words coming out, eyes blank, as if they were trying to speak, but not to us. You have to ask yourself, what kind of healing requires a man to be emptied of his voice? And who or what was waiting on the other side of that silence? Asterisk, the soil around Charity Hill was wrong. Not just in consistency, but in presence. Farmers who plowed too close to the perimeter reported their horses freezing mid-step, machinery failing, tools rusting overnight. And then there were the bones, shallow, disordered, not buried with reverence, but dumped, arms crossed the wrong way, jaws unhinged, spines fractured as if something had twisted them in a final moment of unnatural force. But it wasn't just the dead they found. It was the iron nails. Hundreds of them, driven not into coffins, but into the skulls. 3 per head, forming a triangle. 1 in the forehead, 2 at the base of the neck. As if someone was trying to keep something in. No coroner signed the burial forms. No church performed rites. These were not Christian burials. These were containment rituals, ancient ones. The kind whispered about in Eastern European folklore, in Middle Eastern burial texts. The kind of patterns found in old Siberian plague pits, not to preserve the dead, but to imprison them. Because something had gone wrong. Very wrong. By 1865, the federal government began asking questions, not about the experiments, but about the land. Because something was interfering with signal towers. Telegraph wires near the hospital began transmitting static, random code, sequences of dots and dashes that didn't align with any known language. A man named Vernon Cattle, working for the War Department, visited the site. He arrived healthy, documented as lucid and articulate. Within 3 days, he was institutionalized in the very facility he came to investigate. His final written statement, recovered decades later, reads, "It's not the building, it's what they're pulling through it. They've opened something, a wound in the air, and now it breathes." He died the next night, slit throat. No blood on the walls. Just a copper wire twisted through his jaw and out his ear. The hospital said it was suicide. The autopsy was never conducted. The coffin, empty. This was not madness. This was method. Controlled madness harnessed to breach the membrane between flesh and frequency. And ask yourself this: why was the land around the hospital eventually salted? Why was the earth made sterile for 60 years? Because they weren't trying to erase history. They were trying to starve it. Prevent anything from growing back. But something always does, especially when it's been fed silence, blood, and memory. Keep watching. We're not done. Not by a long shot. Asterisk. The ledger was never meant to be found. It had been sealed behind the plaster of the second-floor wing, a place that hadn't seen foot traffic since 1871, when the ward was mysteriously closed due to structural instability. The truth? That corridor wasn't collapsing. It was sealed. On purpose. Bricked up overnight. No warning to patients. No transfer of records. The hospital staff claimed it was a budgetary issue. But the surviving blueprints show something different. A reorientation of flow. A severing of the hallway from the rest of the building, like a limb amputated, to stop rot from spreading. Inside that wall, beneath the dust and crumbling mortar, was a leather-bound ledger. Dated Winter 1864. Pages warped by moisture. Stained with what was either ink or something more organic. It wasn't written like a hospital record. No columns, no diagnosis codes, just names. And a single phrase. Beside each one, subject reached transition. Over 300 names. Not a single date of death. No physician signatures. Just initials. RMS. We now believe those letters refer to Dr. Raphael Milton Shroud, the hospital's third chief medical officer. Officially, he left his post in December 1864 to join a tuberculosis ward in Boston. Unofficially, he was never seen again. And the final entry in the ledger, presumably in his own hand, is dated the very same day he was reported transferred. That entry reads, "They have begun answering back, first in sleep, then in static, now in mirrors. I must remain to contain them. Burn the east stairwell, remove all glass." What was Dr. Shroud trying to contain? And why does the ledger have a recurring symbol etched beside only 17 of the 300 names? A triangle. 3 nails, 3 doors, the same configuration as the iron, driven into skulls buried behind the hospital. Some researchers now believe these 17 subjects weren't just part of the experiment, they were successful. They reached whatever transition the staff had been trying to provoke. They didn't die. They crossed. Into what? We still can't say. But the 1872 inspection report from a federal marshal who visited the site contains a chilling note in the margin. "I heard them from the bricked wall." Not screams, not words, breathing, measured, intentional. And it wasn't just from one place. It echoed from above, from below. That marshal died 2 weeks later. Poisoned. His coffin, like the others, empty. We're going further now. You've stayed with me this long. But what comes next will not just disturb you, it will change you. So take a breath and descend. Asterisk. There was a room deep beneath the east wing, sealed behind 4 inches of reinforced brick and iron, never listed in any records and never spoken of in public. They called it the convergence room. It wasn't meant for surgery, or quarantine, or treatment. It had no medical equipment, no beds, just a single steel chair bolted to the floor, and 12 viewing windows built into the surrounding walls. As if designed for an audience, the convergence room was discovered in 1972 during a routine inspection by a structural survey team from the Historical Restoration Society. Their records were never released to the public, but one man, Daniel Reinhardt, a junior archivist at the time, kept his own notes, handwritten, hidden inside a hollowed-out hymnal. His journal was recovered by his daughter in 2016. It details what they found when they broke through the outer wall. The room was bone dry, no dust, no decay, as if time itself had refused to touch it. The chair was rusted, yes, but the bolts were still clean, unused. On the wall opposite the chair was a sigil, carved, not painted, deep enough to leave grooves you could bleed on. And there was a smell, not of rot, not mildew, not death. It was familiar and wrong, like something you once knew as a child, but can't remember without crying. Reinhardt said the room had no echo, not even when he shouted. Sound was absorbed, swallowed. He described an overwhelming feeling standing in that room, that something was waiting, not watching, as if the air itself was aware of your presence, as if time in that place moved around you, not with you. They resealed the chamber within hours, but not before Reinhardt took one item, a small, sealed envelope from the wall compartment behind the chair. It held a photograph, undated, undamaged. It showed 5 men and 1 woman standing around the chair. All in 19th century military garb. But the person in the chair wasn't bound. They were smiling, calm, serene. Behind them, in the window glass, was a reflection, something tall. Distorted. Featureless, except for the eyes. Each inspector later denied the room's existence. Their reports were amended. Reinhardt was dismissed from the society 6 weeks later. Cause: unstable mental condition. He moved to Vermont, lived in isolation, never spoke of the hospital again. But the last entry in his personal notes is dated 1981. It reads only, "It followed me home. It waits outside the cellar, every night at 3:17, smiling." And then nothing. No more entries. No final page. Just the sigil, drawn over and over again, until the page turned black. Asterisk, there's a pattern hidden in the dates. If you stack the burial records from 1864 through 1867, not the public registry, but the internal patient disposition logs, you start to see something you were never supposed to notice. Every 7th coffin, every 7th burial, every 7th name was a fabrication, a shell, a shadow. The hospital didn't just bury empty coffins by mistake. It did it rhythmically, ritualistically, like a tithe, like a sacrifice. What you need to understand is that the Union Army had access to hospitals all across the Northeast. Thousands of wounded soldiers were treated in Philadelphia, Harrisburg, and New York, but only one hospital, this one, recorded such a disproportionate number of burials without bodies. And no one raised an alarm, because the hospital answered to no one, not the War Department. Not the medical corps. And certainly not the people who thought they were funding it. Its true oversight came from a private syndicate based in Washington, officially defunct by 1872, but mentioned in backdoor correspondence between two men whose names you do know: Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, and William Seward, the Secretary of State. In a letter dated August 4, 1864, Stanton writes, "The arrangement at Franklin House is holding. The 13th subject is passed successfully. The metrics are by all estimation acceptable. The German has requested further material. Will proceed quietly." Franklin House was the hospital's internal code name. The German was a reference to Dr. Henrik Fauchen, a Prussian neurologist brought over under diplomatic cover in 1863. His specialty wasn't battlefield trauma. It was electrocortical resonance, a theory so obscure even today's neuroscience has barely scratched its surface. But back then, it was occult science. The idea that trauma, not just physical, but emotional, could encode the mind with a frequency. That under the right conditions, these frequencies could be extracted, bottled, transferred, repurposed. Fauchen believed that raw fear left a measurable imprint, one that could be preserved long after death. The subjects weren't patients, they were conduits. And those empty coffins weren't mistakes, they were placeholders, because the real contents weren't bodies, they were resonances, fragments of identity. Terrors captured, distilled, and stored. But for whom? And for what? That answer wasn't in the hospital's records, but it was in the basement. In a locked vault, stamped with a single phrase: "For the continuity of mind." Do you understand? They weren't trying to save lives, they were trying to preserve something else, something older than medicine, and far more dangerous. Asterisk, you've heard whispers of it before. Ideas too strange for science, too structured for superstition. But buried beneath the foundations of that hospital was a vault not just of metal and stone, but of intention. And intention, when fueled by institutional power and secrecy, becomes something far more potent, a system of control. Inside that sealed chamber was no morgue, no archive of surgical tools. What investigators recovered, years later under the guise of storage recovery, were 11 lead containers, cylindrical, marked not with names, but with frequencies. Each one bore a numeric code and a strange repeating glyph. Not military, not medical, something older, something pre-linguistic. They weren't storing organs, they were storing experiences. Or perhaps, more accurately, emotional signatures extracted from individuals at the height of suffering. terror, betrayal, grief, rage. Each specimen wasn't flesh. It was trauma, suspended, preserved, catalogued. Dr. Faucon, in one of his personal journals, later seized by the Bureau of Unnatural Practices, a short-lived and very real postbellum agency, described the process in clinical, almost spiritual terms. In the moment between consciousness and death, the mind sheds its bindings. If the right harmonic field is applied, the residue, what some would call the soul, can be isolated. And if isolated, repurposed. Let that sink in. They were harvesting not life but the imprint of death, and they weren't doing it to save anyone. They were doing it to build a map and atlas of the human psyche under duress, a blueprint for how the mind collapses, and how it might be rebuilt in controlled conditions. This was the seed of what would later become known, in classified circles, as cognitive entrainment theory, the foundation for psychological operations, enhanced interrogation, and even covert behavior modification programs of the 20th century. But it didn't start in the Cold War. It started in 1864. In a quiet hospital outside Gettysburg. With empty coffins and silent rooms and men who never screamed, because by the time anyone heard them, the part that could scream had already been taken. Understand this. This wasn't a failure of medicine. It was a rejection of it. They weren't healing minds. They were mining them, and what they found was useful. To people who would shape the next 100 years of silence, war, and control. Most men believe their thoughts are their own, that what flickers behind their eyes belongs only to them. But in that Pennsylvania facility, they discovered something that shattered that illusion. Thoughts can be planted, and if planted in the right soil, they grow as if born there. It began with patients who didn't remember checking in, soldiers with no next of kin, civilians with dissenting voices who vanished from public record days before reappearing on a gurney. They were given injections, formulas allegedly derived from battlefield morphine, but altered, laced with unknown agents. And then came the recordings. Not with cameras, with tones, low-frequency pulses, played through the floorboards, embedded in the water pipes, hummed through light fixtures. Patterns designed to interrupt inner monologue and replace it. Some patients began speaking in languages they never knew. Others recalled childhood memories from lives that weren't theirs. One man, a railway inspector from Scranton, scrawled a 78-page document in Aramaic, then hung himself using 4 tubing. The doctors called it a failure, but it wasn't. It was a test. The goal wasn't to save minds. It was to learn how to override them. Dr. Faucon and his colleagues were no longer medical men. They were early engineers of what we now call cognitive architecture systems, by which belief, memory, and obedience can be structured from the outside in. And the empty coffins? They weren't just metaphor. They were ritual. Every patient who expired was buried in an unmarked grave. The coffin was paraded publicly, the body never shown. Families were told it was for containment or decomposition. But in truth, those men didn't die the way the ledgers said. Some were never dead at all. They were transferred. Some to asylums in Europe, others to unnamed facilities west of the Mississippi. A few, those who resisted the programming, were lobotomized and kept alive, their brains monitored for years. Their sketches in Faucon's files of crude headset devices, metallic, crown-like, wired into the base of the skull. Devices not used for treatment, but for transmission. Designed to beam thoughts not just into one subject, but across subjects. Hive mind theory. In 1864. Do you see? They weren't studying madness. They were building it from the bones of men who thought they were free. Asterisk, what kind of man looks into another's eyes and sees not a soul, but a circuit? That's what they were doing behind the red doors of that hospital, stripping humanity from the body, reducing the mind to something modular, programmable, and expendable. Once you understand that, You stop asking why they buried empty coffins. You start asking how many programs walked out wearing the faces of men. The facility's eastern wing, destroyed in a fire decades later, was home to what the blueprints labeled as the orientation corridor. But survivors, few and fractured, told a different story. No one remembers walking down that hallway. They only remember waking up at the end of it, feeling different, clean, they said, like a chalkboard wiped. One man, discharged and relocated to Harrisburg, would wake screaming for months, not from nightmares, but from the absence of them. "My mind was too quiet," he wrote in a letter that was intercepted and destroyed. "As if someone vacuumed out my memories and left behind echoes that didn't belong to me." That corridor wasn't just for breaking people, it was for installing. There are whispers in declassified fragments of something called the Echo Protocol, a 6-stage process of identity disintegration, auditory hallucination implantation, emotional rebinding, language reintegration, authority imprinting, and finally, compliance confirmation. It wasn't science fiction. It was science buried in fiction. The staff referred to patients by code names, not names, not even numbers. Names like canary, courier, speaker. Each designation tied to a behavioral trigger. A sound, a color, sometimes a phrase as innocent as good evening. When the patient heard it, something inside shifted, like a key turning in a locked box. Some would salute, others would weep, few would attack, because each one had been programmed to respond in a way pre-selected by the committee overseeing the experiments, not physicians, but liaisons from military intelligence. And when one subject broke free, clawing his own eyes out before running into the nearby woods, the official report claimed he was hallucinating. But the truth was far more precise. He wasn't running from phantoms. He was running from commands he couldn't ignore. The voices weren't in his head. They were outside, feeding back into him through systems designed to bypass will and infect identity. They hadn't cured madness. They had refined it. They always start with the promise of healing. That's how they get you, not with fear, but with hope. And hope is the most dangerous weapon when wielded by those who understand its chemical grip on the human brain. In 1864, this hospital didn't just offer medicine, it promised resurrection, a second life, cleaner, sharper, more obedient. And men came willingly, desperate to be made whole again. But none of them understood what they were trading away. Records, unearthed from a private collection in Harrisburg, reveal something astonishing. Nearly 43% of the men admitted between May and October of that year had no next of kin, no recent correspondences, no history traceable past a single point arrival. At the hospital gates, it's as if they were planted, inserted into the books like characters in a script. Ghost identities, made flesh. And the ones who did have families? The letters they sent home were always the same, not similar, identical, line for line. Word for word. The air is good here. I feel rested. I am making progress. Tell little Sarah I miss her. Copied with such eerie precision, it was as if they were reading from a cue card. And maybe they were. Because after 2 letters, the writing stopped. No more updates, no goodbyes. Only silence. Do you understand the implication? It wasn't just the body they were experimenting on, it was language, memory, the syntax of identity. These men weren't recovering. They were being reformatted. There's a chilling report hidden in the margins of an Army quartermaster's ledger. It describes a shipment received from the hospital, marked as organic surplus. Inside were 32 human tongues, preserved in brine, each labeled with numbers. Not names, numbers. What kind of healing process removes your voice? Only one kind, the kind where your voice becomes a liability. Because if a man remembers too much, he might talk. If he feels too deeply, he might resist. If he dreams, he might break the program. So they learn to sever not just muscle, but meaning. to replace the internal monologue with scripts written by someone else. A man without a voice becomes a man without truth, and a man without truth becomes a tool. You weren't supposed to know this, but now you do. And there's no going back. Are you starting to feel it? That weight in your chest? That's not fear. That's the beginning of waking up. Asterisk, there's a reason the dead don't speak. But in Pennsylvania, 1864, they buried the silence too early. And something started to whisper from beneath the soil. A gravedigger named Elias Broom kept a diary forgotten in the wall of his niece's barn, found only in 1931 during a remodel. In it, he writes of empty caskets heavier than bodies, sealed too tight for wood alone, and a sound like breathing when I passed by after dark. He thought he was losing his mind, until the night he cracked one open. What he found inside changed him, and he never dug another grave again. The coffin was lined with iron on the inside, not for preservation, for containment. And within it lay not a corpse, but a man, alive, sedated, barely breathing, eyes twitching, under closed lids as if trapped in a dream he could not escape. He had no tongue, no fingernails, no identifying marks, except one, a brand seared just above the heart, not a military symbol, not any known emblem, just one perfect circle, with a vertical line split through its center. The symbol appeared again, weeks later, etched into the underside of a hospital bed, then on a set of surgical instruments found hidden in a locked drawer, and then again, carved into the bark of a tree behind the morgue at eye level, where no one but the staff ever went. This wasn't decoration. It was ownership. Each mark said the same thing. Property of the order. An order with no name, no face, no charter. Just a symbol and silence. The hospital was the front. The real work happened underneath it. In the rooms no map ever showed. The ones where the torches burned black instead of gold. The ones where you could scream for hours and not hear your own voice echo back. We think torture leaves marks. We think evil wears a mask. But the most effective control system is clean, white, and sterile. Sanitized horror, brushed steel truth. You're not supposed to feel afraid there, until it's too late. And those men in coffins? They weren't patients. They were failed prototypes, the ones who remembered, who resisted the scripts. They weren't buried for peace. They were buried so the world would never know what was attempted, and what might still be happening. Somewhere, someone is still using that symbol. And if you ever see it, don't look away. They only mark what they plan to keep. The most dangerous experiment is not one that fails. It's one that succeeds in silence. In the aftermath of the war, records of Saint Mercia Infirmary were expunged from nearly every surviving federal archive. No fire, no flood, no war crime could explain that kind of bureaucratic disappearance. It wasn't lost. It was erased. With surgical precision. But you can't fully sterilize the past. There are always fragments, whispers, disjointed reports buried in unrelated case files. One such piece was found in the ledger of a Union Army supply clerk stationed in Harrisburg. He logged in a regular shipment, 6 stretchers, 12 bindings, 5 lead-line crates, delivered to a facility with no listed coordinates, but the shipment receipt bore the same insignia circle and line, and it wasn't just medical. One of the entries included a request for 7 volumes, restricted language, Old German dialect. No known medical operation in 1864 required foreign codices. Unless, of course, you weren't practicing medicine at all. Another mention came from a psychiatric nurse named Margaret Lovelace. Her letters were intercepted posthumously after her death from mercury exposure in 1865. In one letter, she describes a room beneath the embalming theater where she was ordered never to go, but where she heard chanting in a language she swore was older than Latin. She also spoke of a patient, never on the books, who was kept in a drugged trance. Not to heal him, but to extract from him memories, languages, knowledge. He spoke in tongues, backwards, told stories from centuries he could not have lived through. Names of places buried in time, names of men who had never been born, she wrote. They believe the soul stores memory beyond the body, that trauma cracks the shell, makes the spirit bleed knowledge. They don't cure pain here, they feed on it. And what happens to the spirit once they've harvested it? That's where the crates come in, because not all patients left that hospital. But not all stayed, either. The bodies were buried in fields. But the essence, the part that screamed in languages lost to time, was contained in iron sealed under lead, marked with that circle. Why? To replicate it. To sell it. To weaponize the unthinkable. This wasn't a hospital. It was a factory of possession, a place where the veil between man and monster thinned. And someone decided to make a map, asterisk. But to understand how far the roots of this go, you have to stop thinking like a man and start thinking like a system. Hospitals are temples now, sanitized, sterile, instruments of care, wrapped in the language of compassion. But in the 19th century, they were something else entirely, especially state-funded infirmaries, especially those near military zones. They were incubators not for healing, but for control. In Pennsylvania, during the final years of the Civil War, the government wasn't just treating the wounded, it was observing thresholds, psychological breaking points, sleep deprivation, gaslight, hallucinogens, hypnotic suggestion under ether. These were not rogue actors experimenting in secret. They were medical officers under formal seal, reporting to federal bureaus that changed names every 6 months. No one was watching them, because they answered to no one. The reason Saint Mercia buried empty coffins wasn't incompetence. It was protocol, because what was buried wasn't the body, it was the record. A placeholder, a false death, to protect what had been taken, moved, hidden, and the body itself? Repurposed, re-identified, or worse, repossessed, because there are traces reports from post-war asylums in neighboring counties of men appearing with injuries that matched battlefield trauma, but with no enlistment history, no families, no names. But they all said the same thing. I woke up underground, and I wasn't alone. Some described a dark hallway without walls, others a metal coffin where dreams were projected like fire. Most of them didn't live longer than a week. Massive internal hemorrhaging, nervous system failure. But their blood work? Off charts, especially for the era. Elevated cortisol, unnatural clotting, and something else, a protein sequence that modern scientists wouldn't discover until the 1970s. How did it appear in 1864? It didn't, unless it was brought there. You see, this wasn't just about death. It was about arrival, those experiments. If that's even the word, we're reaching for something older than man. Using trauma as the key. War was the theater. Hospitals were the altar. And the blood? The offering. Ask yourself, what did they unlock when they tore through that membrane? And why have we never stopped bleeding since? Saint Mercia didn't vanish because it failed. It vanished because it worked. Asterisk. When they finally sealed off Saint Mercia in early 1865, no official press release was issued. No ceremony, no mourning, just silence. As if the place had never existed at all, but it had. And it left behind fractures in people, in records, in memory. There's one account kept hidden for decades in the possession of the Keller family, descendants of a nurse named Maribeth Keller, who worked in the lower wing of the hospital during its final year. Her handwritten diary, never formally published, paints a picture that sounds less like medicine and more like ritual. She described patients who never ate, never drank, and never blinked, but whose heartbeats continued for weeks. She wrote of surgeons who spoke in whispers around the comatose, repeating Latin phrases in candlelit rooms. And of one room in particular, room 13B, where no records were ever kept, where even the orderlies refused to enter, her final entry, scrawled in trembling ink, said this: "They've begun marking the tongues with gold. Father Leary says it's to keep the silence sacred. But the mouths keep moving at night. They whisper in voices that don't belong to them." The hospital didn't collapse due to fire or neglect. It was emptied deliberately, files removed, bricks dismantled, not a single grave marked. And yet, more than 40 empty coffins were registered to its grounds. But here's what no one talks about. The train manifests dot in the months after Saint Mercia closed. An unusual number of medical transport trains left Harrisburg heading north, not south, where most injured soldiers were being transferred, but toward upstate facilities, many of which were privately owned and funded through obscure charitable foundations. Each train listed only two things: anonymous cargo and specimen handling protocol required. There were no names, no death certificates, just initials. SM, not Saint Mercia, submerged memory. That's what SM came to stand for in certain post-war psychological circles. A reference to patients who remembered things that hadn't happened to them, who spoke in foreign languages they never learned, who predicted deaths with stunning accuracy, often days before they occurred. Were these men survivors? Or were they the carriers? You must understand, some secrets are never buried to be forgotten. They are buried to ferment, and when they rise again, they do not come back alone. The further you go into this, the harder it becomes to deny what was really happening beneath the hospital floors. In the years after Saint Mercia's closure, a quiet network of psychologists and neurologists began circulating something called the Dulin Brief. Never publicly acknowledged, never printed, just passed from hand to hand like a cursed inheritance. Named after Dr. Emery Dulin, one of the last neurophysicians stationed at the hospital before its restructuring. The brief detailed a specific category of patients, wounded soldiers who, upon treatment, displayed no signs of brain trauma, and yet something had changed drastically. Their handwriting was different, speech patterns altered, childhood memories wiped clean, replaced with knowledge no one could trace. In one chilling case, a Pennsylvania boy who had never left his family farm described in detail the street layout of Marseille, France, including buildings that didn't exist. Until the 20th century, there was a pattern if you could stomach it. A post-operative silence, then dreams. Then the emergence of what Dulin called residual intelligence. Thoughts not their own, obsessions with symbols. Recurring drawings, spirals, gates, doors. And one phrase scratched into multiple bed frames across the asylum's west wing: the mouth that never closes. That wasn't metaphor. It was literal. Dulin began tracking the patients after their release. Or what he believed was their release. But that's the thing, he never found a single one. Every name listed as transferred. But no receiving hospital ever claimed them. No families reported their return. They had simply vanished. So where did they go? There are whispers about the Montrose Institute in northern Vermont, an abandoned sanatorium now. But in 1866, it received a sudden $1.4 million endowment from an unnamed donor. Records suggest it began receiving patients marked as M and categorized, a military term that doesn't exist in any public archive. Some say that stood for mentally non-compliant. Others say it meant something else entirely. Mnemonic necrosis. The death of memory, not the patients. Ours. What if the procedures at Saint Mercia weren't just about trauma recovery? What if they were attempts to erase, to scrub the very idea of a person and replace it with something useful, compliant, and secret-bearing? Because if a man can forget who he is, you can teach him anything, even how to lie for the state, even how to kill without guilt, even how to carry ancient knowledge and not remember where it came from. In 1873, nearly a decade after Saint Mercia was shut down, a man named Levi Harnett walked into a post office in Maryland, claiming to be a discharged soldier from the 6th Pennsylvania Infantry. His uniform was decades out of date, the serial number on his badge belonged to a man who had died at Antietam, and when asked where he had been for the last 10 years, he replied, "In the White Room, waiting for the music to stop." He was arrested, examined, deemed schizophrenic. But before his records could be processed, a government official arrived from Washington with sealed documents, removed Harnett from the facility, and left behind one instruction: do not mention his name again. But someone did. An investigative journalist named Carolyn Burke followed the case for 4 years, trailing scattered reports of men like Harnett appearing across rural America, confused, silent, and always barefoot. Always barefoot. As if they had walked away from something no man was meant to survive. Burke's final article was never published, but a carbon copy of her manuscript exists in the Library of Congress archives, redacted and misfiled under agricultural correspondence.in. She writes of an underground network of facilities built during and after the Civil War, not for healing, but for harvesting. Not organs, not blood, but memory, identity, truth. These men weren't just veterans, they were experiments, vessels. Some came back wrong. Some didn't come back at all. And in the margins of her manuscript, scrawled over and over again, in increasingly frantic pen strokes, they buried the bodies, but the minds are still alive. What does that mean? It means you've been taught to think of identity as permanent, as sacred. But what if it's just a system, a collection of scripts? Triggers, reactions like code that can be rewritten if the tools are dark enough, old enough, brutal enough. And what if Saint Mercia was never really shut down? What if it just changed names? Rebranded, folded into the quiet machinery of modern psychology, intelligence work, behavior studies. Look at DARPA, look at McUltra, look at black sites, test facilities. Think tanks hidden beneath the innocuous signage of trauma recovery centers and veterans programs. Look at the number of men who go in for treatment and come back different, or don't come back at all. They buried empty coffins, because what they removed couldn't be buried in the earth. It had to be sealed, silenced, forgotten. And that's why you're only hearing this now. You were never supposed to hear about Saint Mercia. Not from books, not from teachers, and certainly not from official history. Because to acknowledge it would be to admit something far more terrifying than war or death. The calculated erasure of the self. What happens in a world where governments, or the entities hiding behind them, can dismantle a man's mind like clockwork? Where consciousness can be stripped, reprogrammed, or erased entirely, leaving behind a breathing body with no anchor to memory, no voice of resistance, no soul to scream. Buried in a congressional report from 1876, misfiled under budget expenditures. For wartime hospitals, is a single line item flagged as neural behavioral suppression. Phase 4. Continuation approved under Title 9B. There are no files under Title 9B, not in any archive, not in any military system that civilians can access. But the line item shows a funding trail that snakes through postbellum Washington, into private contractors, into emerging fields of psychology that weren't even formally recognized until the 20th century. And that trail doesn't stop. It leads into Cold War programs, into shadow projects beneath Langley, into trauma-based conditioning and so-called rehabilitation facilities where veterans disappeared under the pretense of treatment. What do you think happened to the minds that couldn't be put back together? The men who screamed too loudly in the night, who remembered too much, who couldn't forget no matter how many electrodes, drugs, or sensory deprivation tanks were forced on them. They were silenced, or worse, used as test cases, as puppets. Saint Mercia may have been the beginning, but it was never the end. The techniques evolved, they were perfected. And today, they don't need the White Room. They have media, noise, algorithms, 1,000 ways to fragment identity without laying a single finger on you. You think you're immune? Tell me the last day you went without checking the screen, without scrolling, without absorbing endless streams of curated panic, pleasure, distraction. Your mind is still the battlefield. Only now the hospital comes to you through your feed, through your entertainment, through the therapy they sell as healing, but which teaches you how to comply, not how to break free. You weren't taught to heal. You were taught to forget, to self-edit, to bury your truth in an empty coffin, just like they did. Asterisk, they never buried the bodies. Just the names, the memories, the connections. Because you can't control a man who remembers who he is. And Saint Mercia, that cursed soil in Pennsylvania, wasn't just a hospital. It was a prototype. What began as trauma treatment for civil war veterans evolved into a doctrine, a manual for psychological demolition. Veterans who had stared into the abyss came home needing help. What they got was containment, isolation, and in too many cases, complete erasure. Not physically, their bodies lived on, but the parts of them that made choices, that remembered their wives, their pasts, their outrage. Gone. We have this image of the Victorian era as old, crude, unsophisticated. But that's the lie. They were testing surgical memory extraction before electricity was widely available. They were using alkaloid compounds derived from nightshade and belladonna to induce dreamless comas. Not to comfort, to reset, to wipe, to delete. A whistleblower, buried in the footnotes of a forgotten psychological journal from 1893, described what he saw as an orderly at Facility 12, a code name for Saint Mercia after it was officially decommissioned. He spoke of a wing where patients wore numbers, not names, where nurses were forbidden from making eye contact, where any man who showed signs of recovery was relocated immediately and never seen again. And here's the part that should shake you. His testimony wasn't debunked. It wasn't even investigated. It was ignored. Ignored because exposing it would have forced a reckoning with a darker truth that our institutions, medical, military, governmental, are not guardians of healing, but instruments of suppression. That healing, real healing, threatens control. A man who heals remembers. And a man who remembers asks questions. Dangerous ones. You wonder why there's such a war on memory today, on history, on masculinity, on self-knowledge? Because every tyrant fears the same thing, the return of the fully awakened man. So Saint Mercia wasn't shut down. It spread. Its principles infected every new regime of care. Its silence trained a generation of doctors to forget their oaths. Its coffins taught bureaucrats how to bury consequences without dirt. And now, you live in the age of Saint Mercia 2.0. Digital, sanitized, efficient, no lobotomy scars. Number. Padded rooms. Just screens and silence, and men who no longer know what was taken from them. Asterisk. But some of us, a few of us, hear the echo, the hum beneath the surface. That quiet frequency of things erased, but not forgotten. And once you tune into it, you can't unhear it. The empty coffins whisper. They always have. The soil remembers the weight it never carried. And the air around Saint Mercia still hums with the cries of men who were reading without their permission. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment, brief, disorienting, when you forgot something important? A memory you should have but can't retrieve. The name of a place. A face. The feeling of standing in a room you've never entered, yet knowing something happened there. That's not imagination. That's residue. That's what's left when reality is edited. But the soul refuses to comply. Saint Mercia was supposed to be a footnote, a closed file. But it left fingerprints on everything. On trauma therapy. On psychiatric coding systems. Even on how we define sanity today. They created the DSM, the Bible of mental health, not to heal, but to classify, to assign numbers to minds, and behind each code, a treatment protocol, and a leash, a way to tell if you were deviating from the script. And if you were, correction, containment, compliance, and the coffin? It's symbolic now. You don't need pine wood and nails to erase a man. You just need a label: PTSD, bipolar, dissociative. Once labeled, he's processed, he's medicated, he's discredited, and most importantly, he's dismissed. See the genius? You don't silence him. You let him speak, then call it madness. You don't lock him away. You just remove his credibility. And the rest of the world does the locking for you. The facility may be gone, but the method is thriving. It's taught in universities, enforced in hospitals, and ritualized in the algorithms that now decide what you're allowed to think, say, and feel. The next time you hear someone speak truth, and then watch them vanish, the next time a man tells a story that can't be proven, and you feel a strange fear in your gut, you're not crazy. You're remembering what you were made to forget. Saint Mercia didn't fail. It succeeded beyond measure. And you, watching this now, you are one of the few still capable of seeing the cracks in the facade. Now you have to ask yourself, what are you going to do with that site? By now, the question isn't whether the hospital buried empty coffins. It's how many more they buried, metaphorically and otherwise, across institutions, cities, and time. What was tested at Saint Mercia wasn't a localized program. It was a prototype. And once the prototype worked, they didn't need the building anymore. They needed scalability, mass application, silence repackaged as care. Did you know that after Saint Mercia shut its doors in 1867, multiple regional asylums across Pennsylvania and Ohio adopted something called the Mercian Protocol? That's the actual name, buried in medical reports from 1870 through 1879. And what was this protocol? Patients classified not by symptoms, but by suggestibility scores. A score based on how easily a person could be led to reject their memories, rewrite their narrative, and adopt a version of reality more aligned with authority figures. In other words, the most curable patients were those willing to forget who they were. Sound familiar? Today we call it compliance. We reward it. We incentivize it with social approval, medication, early release from programs. It's not healing. It's psychological domestication. But here's where it gets darker. The patients who scored lowest on the Mercian Protocol, the ones who wouldn't bend, weren't offered different treatment. They were reassigned. To where? No one knows, not one paper trail, not one census entry, not even a transport log. Just a redacted stamp and an absence of further record. That's when the coffins increased. Between 1868 and 1873, over 400 burials were recorded under Saint Mercia's extended patient program, even though the hospital had already been officially closed for 6 years, and none of those graves had names. Just codes. And here's where we descend one more level. Those codes match early identifiers in the military psychiatric index used during the Spanish-American War. Same formatting, same category PREFIXE is. So the question becomes, were these patients buried or repurposed? Because men with fractured psyches are easier to rebuild than men with strong ones. Break a man's memory, and he'll take whatever version of the world you give him. These weren't graves. They were vaults, sealed containers for stolen identities. And you, right now, are standing at the edge of that vault. You've heard the whispers. You've seen the empty names. And soon, you'll have to decide. Do you keep digging? Or do you close the lid and pretend it never existed? Asterisk, there is a reason this history was buried. And it wasn't to protect the public from disturbing facts. It was to protect the system from discovery. You see, institutions like Saint Mercia weren't accidents. They weren't outliers. They were prototypes for a future where identity could be manufactured, suppressed, or erased, all under the guise of treatment, all in the name of science, security, or sanity. In 1871, a series of correspondences between Pennsylvania state officials and a little-known federal department, the Office for Cognitive and Moral Hygiene, reveal a chilling phrase repeated in multiple memos. Subject profiles have been successfully neutralized for future integration. That phrase, future integration, would appear again 40 years later in World War I psychological conditioning programs, then again in 1950s MKUltra memos, then again in modern biometric database integration logs. It began in a hospital you were never supposed to know existed. Saint Mercia's files didn't just disappear, they were relocated, folded into larger projects, renamed, reclassified, encrypted with new terminology. But the mechanism stayed the same. Isolate the dissenter, strip the narrative, replace the identity, bury the record. Do you feel it yet? This story isn't about 1864 anymore. This is about now. Because today, they don't need a hospital. They have a phone, a feed, a profile. They don't have to sedate you. They'll distract you. They don't need to fake your death. They'll replace your attention. They'll give you 100 false versions of reality until you stop looking for the real one. And for those who still ask questions, silence them, diagnose them. And if none of that works, erase them, not with violence, but with invisibility. Strip their story until they become an empty coffin. Something that once held meaning, now reduced to absence. Saint Mercia was never just a building. It was a beginning. And unless you remember that, unless you recognize the echoes of its methods in your own reflection, your own thoughts, your own digital life, then you're not walking away from this story untouched. You're living it. And that's the final veil. The realization that this isn't history. It's still happening. And now that you've heard this, you can never unknow it. Here's the truth they prayed you'd never piece together. The reason this story vanishes from the textbooks, the documentaries, the official archives. Saint Mercia didn't just bury empty coffins. It buried something far more dangerous, the proof that identity, memory, and reality itself could be manufactured, erased, or reshaped at will by those in power. You think you're free because you have choices. But Saint Mercia taught them the most efficient way to enslave the human mind wasn't chains or bars. It was the destruction of narrative continuity. If you cannot trust your past, you cannot shape your future. And if your future is a script written by someone else, you are no longer a man. You're a role, a mask, a file. Think about the names. The patients who never existed. The graves that held only cloth and straw. Now ask yourself, how many modern names, identities, and lives are just as hollow? How many of us carry stories we didn't write? Personalities formed by algorithms, not experience? Beliefs chosen for us through targeted dopamine loops. Do you think they stopped at hospitals? No. They moved into schools, into screens, into the very language we use to describe ourselves. But Saint Mercia left behind a crack, a fault line in the foundation. And you just walked through it. Because now you've seen the system from beneath. Not from the sanitized history books, but from the dirt beneath the coffins, where the secrets rot and whisper. That whisper is calling to you now. Not with fear, but with fire. You were born into a lie, but you don't have to die in one. If you've made it this far, you've already changed. You've seen through one veil, and that means you can tear down others. You are not an echo. You are not a diagnosis. You are not a coffin. You are the one thing they fear most. An awakened man with memory intact, truth in hand and rage in his eyes. Now tell me, in the comments, no more empty coffins. Twice, write it once for the dead, and once for the living you refuse to become. This is the Macabre record, and this was just the beginning.